World War Z might be the best and most famous of all zombie stories. Originally based on the book of the same name by Max Brooks, a movie later followed, and finally a game. And while the movie was the most successful zombie film in history, and that became the second successful point of the World War Z universe, a sequel was planned due to the film's success, but budget issues had led to the sequel being canceled in February 2019, which means that the game might end up being the third pinnacle for the story, and unfortunately, the final one. With everything going on in the World War Z game being far bigger and better than anyone might have expected, I went back and rewatched the movie and listened to the audiobook. And I've got to say, the audiobook is maybe the best done audiobook that I've ever listened to. So if you're interested and don't feel like reading the book like I did the first time I went through World War Z, maybe give the audiobook a listen. You're probably not going to be disappointed. Anyway, given that this little channel is mostly about video games and movies, a question started to nag at me. Exactly how survivable is World War Z? And I do mean all versions, the book, the film, and the game. Obviously, the book kind of goes over how survivable it is because Max Brooks, to his credit, was kind of detailed. I do feel like there are some inaccuracies, which I will later point out to address how survivable a more realistic take on World War Z might be as far as the book goes. However, the film and the game are probably going to be untouched as far as changing them because there's not much to change because that survivability is largely based on the zombies, not so much external world factors. The question is, how survivable is it for humanity as a whole and for the individual person on the ground? So the way this works is I'm going to summarize the story and the mechanics of the world depicted and then go over the zombie virus and how it works and differs before going into things like what survivors could do and the hardships that they might face and things that might make surviving a little bit more likely. Honestly, it isn't fully explained how it all started. For the book, the first case occurred in Asia, when a small town was moved and a boy and his father went diving at the site of the original town in a lake, and during the dive the boy was bitten, and the father was never seen again. One thing leads to another, and the boy died and then reanimated as the first official case recorded in the book. He then attacked those who attempted to restrain him and ended up infecting a few others. By that point they had yet to reanimate. However, it is implied by the doctor who made the visit that this was in fact not the first case, but was indeed part of the earliest seeds of the eventual outbreak and downfall of mankind. Further evidence is implied if you read between the lines. The complete quarantine of the village the boy was from, in theory, should have completely solved the problem by containing the outbreak. Other evidence would be the fact that the doctor calls a friend who knows what's going on, or at least he's heard of this before, so I tend to think that this boy may not have been the first case, with the village surrounded and nobody else who was bitten able to get away. That leads to the conclusion that somebody else or other people were infected and eventually slowly and surely fan out and start to infect more people, and they start to reanimate, and it continues. For zombie worlds, this type of outbreak is what I call the slow burn. The zombies don't take over immediately, nor do they spread rapidly, conquering large swaths of land in mere hours. The book refers to this time as the Great Denial because in a time of technology and an interconnected world, the existence of these creatures didn't remain a secret for all that long, but it was also not taken seriously by the public or even officials, often considered to be a hoax or an issue that didn't directly concern them by the former and a distant threat by the latter. The undead expanded slowly but surely across borders, as people fled from their countries in fear and hopes of escaping the virus. Smugglers would transport people, sometimes infected, to new countries as they attempted to outrun what they were bringing with them or inadvertently traveling in the company of. Eventually, the presence of infected people became more and more common, and if I recall right, even costing smugglers entire cargo holds of people who were sometimes dropped off on the coast of their destination, and sometimes not. The first real showing of Zack had occurred in Cape Town, resulting in casualties and was the cause of the virus being called African rabies in the earliest days of what would turn out to be the largest civil war in human history. Still, people denied the issue that Zach was starting to pose. In much of the world, the public remained blissfully ignorant. Officials embraced the narrative that the virus was nothing more than some unknown strain of rabies, and in many countries, very little was done. Some admittedly did build great fortifications, but for the US, it was more than happy to believe that this was nothing more than just some previously unknown form of rabies. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the US because the book does focus quite a bit on what happens in the US, and because I'm from the United States, it's a little easier to give the perception of how someone might survive here. I don't know all the rules and laws of other countries, and as far as weapons and what people can and cannot own, it's a little difficult to venture a guess. So, getting back to the history of it. Leadership did, however, authorize the formation and deployment of alpha teams. These so-called alpha teams were special operations forces that were sent in to terminate and destroy small outbreaks within the borders of the United States. Their success rate was astonishing and clear by their ability to keep this issue as some obscure thing going on in other parts of the world. That was not all leadership had done. They fast-tracked the approval of a drug that was supposed to be a vaccination against African rabies, and while it did contain a vaccination against rabies, it did absolutely nothing to protect against the zombie virus. Later it was officially known as the Solanum virus. This was merely a measure to help maintain composure and order and to avoid a panic. This vaccination was sold in droves as people took it to prevent against Solanum, earning everyone money but also wasting precious time. Not that they could have found a real vaccination or cure in that amount of time, which is something that the book does clearly mention. As the name says, this era was the Great Denial, for people of all levels, from everyday citizens to leadership. To Americans, this was nothing to worry about. They didn't know much of anything about the reality of the Solanum virus, and kept blissfully in the dark by the news, who was, according to the book, didn't benefit much of anything by notifying the public of the true nature of the blight that was rapidly plaguing the rest of the world. However, without proper warning or preparation, and without taking anything that might have been seen online seriously, Americans were woefully unprepared for what was about to happen, and in many cases did and knew very little about it. Eventually the virus got to a point where officials couldn't contain it. Either they didn't have the resources, or infected were simply not detected and slipped through the cracks, allowing for the infection to spread. This period of time was about to be known as the Great Panic, and as the name implies, it was a time when reality set in for the populace of America. The truth of what they were about to face was clear, and in some cases gnashing its teeth literally in their faces and in their homes. This was a time period where humanity and civility broke down. People were attempting to outrun the rapidly growing hordes and began clogging the freeways and interstates until they eventually became parking lots. Civility broke down, and in some cases, a sense of lawlessness took over. People would loot and steal, often targeting places that sold food or gear to survive in the wilderness. Large cities like New York were rapidly overrun and swelled Zach's numbers by literally millions. To boost public morale and instill faith, the military decided a decisive victory was needed. The Battle of Yonkers is important because it plays to the book's interpretation of the effectiveness of conventional weapons. Something I feel might be incorrect, and while it is not the only thing I think is incorrect, and that will later be factored into this situation and accounted for when we talk about how survival might look during a World War Z zombie infestation. It's a bit more realistic when you consider what might be inaccurate, but the Battle of Yonkers might be one of the most significant elements, as it proposes military hardware and technology is inadequate in this situation. Anyway, leadership, desperate to assure the American people that their military could stop the hordes of undead, had set up in Yonkers, at an ideal location that forced the countless numbers of undead from New York City to be bottlenecked down to the width of a multi-lane highway. Fighting Zach as if they were setting up defensive positions against an oncoming conventional force, the army dug fighting holes for troops and even tanks to allow for them to fire from hull-down positions, a tactic used to protect the tanks from incoming fire. The army didn't know, or simply didn't care, that the reality of it was that they were setting up in a manner that wasn't ideal for the enemy they were fighting, forcing troops to fortify and fight in mob suits, which are suits designed to protect a soldier fighting in an unclean chemical or biological environment. The army disregarded the logical tactical positioning of troops determined by the type of enemy they were fighting, and decided that putting troops in elevated positions and not on the ground, making them vulnerable, was not how they wanted to position forces. It's stated in the book that rooftops would have been ideal and could have held at least a company of men. It also mentions the presence of an apartment structure with many balconies that would have offered soldiers an ideal firing position for the enemy they were facing. However, command, as I said, kept troops on the ground to give cameras an up-close and impressive show of force, either without considering the danger of this or simply not caring and determining that the trade-off was worth it. When Zach arrived, the Army responded with the deployment of MLRS strikes. An MLRS, or Multiple Launch Rocket System, is a self-propelled rocket artillery piece that fires any number of munitions. In this case, it fired a rocket that breaks into sub-munitions and carpets an area. The first MLRS strike, according to the book, did a lot of damage to the zombies, but mostly because of the parking lot of cars the freeway had become. The second strike and subsequent artillery barrage from the 155mm Paladin self-propelled howitzers did substantially less. The remainder of the battle was fought with small arms, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Humvees, M1A2 Abrams battle tanks, and air assets in the area were mentioned to be the RAH-66 Comanche, a helicopter that was canceled prior to production and has an official number of 2 being built. And then as the battle started to degrade and Zach started to gain ground, the Air Force stepped in and released thermal barrack ordnance as the Army retreated. The devastating defeat at Yonkers was made worse by the military anticipating a victory and allowing cameras in close and broadcasting the battle nationally. What could have been a valuable lesson that Zach doesn't stagger around with small arms squirting off rounds and calling in airstrikes ended up being a national panic-inducing moment. Our mighty war machine, unable to stop unarmed hordes, ended up bringing American morale to an all-time low and fear to an all-time high. The news, then, for ratings and money, would replay the footage of the defeat as often as possible while doing what can be expected and basically not conveying any useful information, but certainly stirring people into a panic and eventually costing a lot of lives as people began to flee for their very lives. Shortly after the defeat at Yonkers, the government adopted the Rediker Plan. Already adopted by several countries around the world, the Rediker Plan, also commonly known as the South African Plan, called for a retreat of all leadership to a naturally easy-to-defend zone that puts many natural obstacles between the zombies and the uninfected as possible, which is a logical thought process when retreating from such an enemy. Where the Rediker Plan came under criticism was that leadership should only take civilians who were useful and worth being taken along. This could be skilled labor or people with degrees or training that could be useful for wartime production, construction, human services, and alike. To that end, those deemed not useful were simply not taken along, but the plan did call for a lot of them to be put in defendable locations and then resupplied by the military regularly to act as bait for the majority of the zombies, keeping them busy and away from the relocated populace. This is not to say that some people couldn't make their way to a safe zone. The book contains a segment about a man in a wheelchair who was there. So it's reasonable to assume that as things got set up, there came to be more and more need for unskilled labor. This unskilled labor, like janitorial or sanitation services, were often fulfilled by former white-collar workers who were probably considered unskilled labor when the military and the leadership was relocating. After the Rediker Plan was adopted, the news did start to tell people to go north as far as they could, still inadequately informing them as what to bring, how long they would be there, and what survival would be like, and such useful survival information. Simply put, they were just told head north because cold temperatures and winter weather would end up freezing the zombies for the duration of winter, offering civilians a temporary reprieve from the danger. This didn't mean that things were easy. People camped in large groups, and as food ran out, people became hostile to each other and in some cases even resorted to cannibalism. The year following the defeat at Yonkers saw the fall of the US and the majority of the world. Every country coped with the zombie plague differently, but it seems that none got away clean. Despite that, the Rediker plan was adopted. Securing the Western safe zone was anything but assured or simple. The safe zone itself had to be cleared of zombies within its own borders, and then defend against hordes entering the safe zone and contend with the coastal assaults from zombies prowling the ocean. Admittedly, this was a little bit less of a threat. The most notable moment of this period was the Battle of the Five Colleges. Armed with substandard weaponry, university students fortified their schools and held out against thousands upon thousands of zombies pouring in from the Los Angeles area. The military started the process of clearing hordes from the safe zone and launched a number of search and destroy missions within the confines of the safe zone. After some time, the major hordes were terminated and the focus shifted to terminating stragglers. Looking for lone or smaller groups of zombies requires a more methodical search and is the difference between a pair of scissors and a chainsaw. As a result, the military was at least assisted in some areas and at most completely supplemented in others by the volunteer neighborhood security teams, or NSTs. Either way, the tactic was more of a methodical sweep and clear, searching homes and then likely securing them afterwards to give the zombies nowhere to actively hide. After some time and great effort, things in the safe zone began to stabilize. Zombies were, for the most part, completely eradicated within the boundaries of that safe zone, and leadership could now begin to focus on starting the process of sustainability and then manufacturing for wartime production to liberate everything east of the Rocky Mountains that was completely infested and lost to the zombies. Some survivors were holding out deep behind enemy lines as the Rediker plan called for, but with a safe zone to rearm and refit, the military had no intention of leaving 2/3 of the country in the hands of the zombies. Things were rapidly changing, and as safe as the Western safe zone happened to be, it still was not safe enough or far enough from mainland hordes for leadership to remain. As a result, the entire capital was moved to Hawaii as a safeguard to assure leadership for the times ahead that were going to be full of struggle and change. The government remained the same, and even to the extent that the president demanded that elections should be held, citing that all Americans had was their ideals of what America represents. As a whole, the government didn't have much in the way of change, and nothing worth noting, and is only mentioned because the existence of a cohesive government means that survival within the safe zone might have been at least a little more normal than in a zombie-held territory. The most important change that altered life for residents in the safe zone, and then later, by cause and effect, the rest of the nation, was the formation of the Department of Strategic Resources, or DISTRESS for short. The mission of DISTRESS was to handle all resources from housing and medicine to even raw materials. DISTRESS's mission was to ration the resources they had, find more, oversee the manufacture or production of items, and determine what projects got the resources that they had. The view of things within the safe zone would actually be the first time since World War II that the entire population of the United States was at least expected to sacrifice and contribute to the war effort. Distress was focused on getting refugees separated into groups. Those were able to assist, but unskilled in labor might have been put on a job harvesting on a farm. Skilled labor were often turned into trainers, training their trade to unskilled labor forces. As a result, white-collar workers were often classified as unskilled labor and sent off to training programs where a businessman might end up being a plumber and an accountant might end up being a gunsmith assembling or repairing rifles. Stress, however, was actually far more powerful of a department than just putting people to work. Their control over resources gave them de facto control over the military, or at least how the military would or could fight. Distress used this power by analyzing the RKR, or resource kill ratio, and gave the resources to the projects or items that held the highest ratio. In other words, giving the military the most bang for its buck. In practical terms, it might be something like the military might want fuel and ordnance for airstrikes, but if Distress thought that it was useless or a waste of resources, they could deny that, or simply deny requests to manufacture replacement parts to repair the jets or other equipment that they deemed to be a waste of resources. giving Distress a way to have input in military tactics by controlling the equipment and supplies available. As a result, weapon systems like the M1A1 and M1A2 Abrams were no longer seen as viable combat weapons and were warehoused. The Air Force was almost completely gutted. All jets and heavy cargo lift aircraft like the C-17 and C-5 Galaxy were mothballed. It's worth pointing out that they were not destroyed, but they were also not being actively used, since Distress deemed that they burned too much fuel and the ordnance for the fighters was not effective enough to justify the use of them. The same thing happened with a lot of infantry weapons. The M4, M16, M249, M240, and M2HB, along with rocket launchers and grenade launchers, were all warehoused, along with a lot of Humvees. However, some mechanized warfare items, like the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, were upgraded for the eventual clashes with hostile militias. The Air Force was reduced to running resupply missions across infected territory in old C-130 cargo plane. The areas being resupplied were active military zones, civilian zones, areas that were being held by skeleton crews, but were deemed important enough for the war effort once liberated that they should be resupplied and guarded. And then you had repair and refuel zones for C-130s. It was not just the Air Force feeling the pain of Distress's big red pen. The Army was no longer a mechanized unit and marched wherever they were going. As I said, their guns were replaced by a rifle called the Standard Infantry Rifle, or SIR for short. More closely resembling a rifle from World War II, the SIR was said to be accurate and reliable. Standard ammo for the SIR was the PI, or Pyrotechnically Initiated Explosive, which is just a fancy way to say it was an incendiary bullet. However, means of travel and weaponry was not the only change to the Army. The camo uniforms were ditched for solid navy blue uniforms that were able to cover the whole body and were bite resistant. The retooling of the military did take time, but 7 years after the defeat at the Battle of Yonkers, the military was ready and deployed to engage in the Battle of Hope. Set in Hope, New Mexico, and of absolutely no strategic importance, this testing ground for the new vision of the U.S. military to combat Zach was chosen purely because they wanted the fight to begin in a city named Hope. With new weapons, uniforms, and gear, and ditching the combined arms tactics utilized in ground warfare since at least World War II, now things were a little different. The idea was to bring them in and keep a steady flow of lead going downrange at a rate of about 1 shot per soldier per second. When a soldier ran out of ammo, they would swap out to reload, so there was no gaps in the line, and fire was continually poured on the zombies. No longer were the so-called days of spraying lead at the zombies. Now battle doctrine stated they were to be quickly and efficiently taken out with headshots. The battle lasted for hours upon hours, but by the next morning it was over, and the new tactics had proven to be successful, giving the U.S. military its first large victory against the zombies throughout the entire war. It proved to command that the newly tooled army to fight zombies was effective against hordes, which were probably the greatest threat. The victory at the Battle of Hope was the first step in liberating the rest of the U.S. and then later the world, or at least assisting other countries that wanted help with supplies or combat troops actually on the ground putting lead on target, because some countries wanted assistance and some preferred to handle it on their own. Anyway, with the retooled military battle proven, it was time to take action. Following the Honolulu Conference, the United States announced its intention to mobilize the military and go on the offensive against Zach, an unpopular decision with many other nations who would have preferred simply surviving and waiting for the zombies to rot away. In the coming decades, as the zombies infected early in the outbreak were already showing signs of advanced decomposition, the president argued that the only way to restore dignity and pride to humanity was by taking back the nation by force and putting an end to Zach by force and not on Zach's terms. Resolute in the decision, with or without the rest of the world following their lead, the order was given, launching a multi-year campaign to push eastwards over the Rocky Mountains and all the way to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. The campaign was commonly known as the Road to New York and ended up being a massive undertaking. Strategically speaking, tactics were simple, but also monumental. Similar to line searches during search operations held by law enforcement, where a line of officers, firefighters, or trained volunteers walk spaced out from each other, but close enough to one another to allow for an effective and clean sweep of an area. The military did the same thing, but on a much larger scale, creating two lines spanning from the northern border all the way to the southern border, and then they just started to walk east while slowly and methodically clearing all zombies that they encountered. If a section of the line came under heavy contact, troops from the rear would leapfrog past them and maintain an unbroken line. While effective, this type of battle was slow going. The biggest risks to soldiers weren't even the zombies. They had to contend with long eradicated illnesses infecting troops, landmines left behind, booby traps set by survivalists, and outright firefights with other survivalists who didn't want to go back to the land of law and order and preferred to be the king or queen of zombies. If that wasn't enough danger, there were also feral animals like wild dogs, and then you had feral humans, which were, generally speaking, a child who was orphaned or otherwise abandoned in an infected zone. Spending years growing up on its own, it reverted back to a primitive state. HR teams were dispatched with troops to tranquilize the feral human for rehabilitation. Buildings also wanted to kill people. After years upon years of neglect, some buildings were highly unstable and would easily collapse. The final threat to soldiers would be quislings. Quislings were people who tried to appease zombies and completely lost their minds and began to believe that they were zombies. Now, Zach had no issue with telling a quisling from a zombie and would generally eat them as they lay there silently getting gnawed on and ripped apart. However, quislings believing that they were zombies made him dangerous to soldiers because, like a zombie, they would attack a soldier, and quislings were so far gone mentally that no amount of rehabilitation was able to fix them. The only difference really between a zombie and a quisling, aside from the fact that a zombie is a legit zombie, is that a quisling was unable to spread the virus. After a long campaign, the road to New York was finished, and the U.S. was declared free of infected. The military at that point would allow troops to leave if they wanted or remain to assist in clearing out other countries like Canada and Mexico, who moved their militaries to the border to make the U.S. sweep possible. Troop retention was actually very high, along with many volunteers, to the point that they actually had to turn some people away. The remainder of the world was at different points in clearing their own nations, but after a long and drawn-out fight, the end of hostilities was declared, despite that there were still a few white zones or infected areas that needed to be cleared, including a country and the floor of the ocean, which still contained a large number of zombies. The official count for zombies combated in the road to New York City was unknown, but estimated to be more than 200 million. Now that the world of World War Z has been explained to you, we have a little bit more to go over, and that topic is the zombies themselves. World War Z is not consistent throughout its universe. The zombies in the books are different than those in the movie, and the game has zombies that are different from both the movie and the book. When you think zombie, you either think The Walking Dead's type of slow, staggering, clumsy buffoons with a strong craving to munch on people, or you think of zombies like 28 Days Later, where they have their track shoes on and they're laced up and they're coming after you. The zombies in World War Z vary depending on what media you are encountering. If you read the book, you're basically going to get what you might expect with The Walking Dead. They are slow, uncoordinated, but given numbers they are able to climb on top of each other to get to a piece of food, also known as pyramiding. A brisk walk could easily put distance between you and a book version zombie. The movie is another story altogether. Not only are the zombies physically different in the movie, but their motives are also different. In the book, they purely want to consume other animals, but in the movie, they attack to spread the infection. Once bitten, they leave that prey to reanimate and move on to the next uninfected human. Also, another difference would be, in the book, it's stated that infection to reanimation can take weeks, but in the movie, it takes between 10 and 12 seconds. This was likely done for narrative reasons, and spoiler alert here, the idea was they wouldn't attack humans that were healthy, so a vaccination from deadly viruses or diseases were used as a form of camouflage to make combating them easier. However, the biggest difference between the book zombies and those other movies would be that in the movie, they more closely resemble the zombies from 28 Days Later. They are all track star athletes and sprint like cheetahs, giving them the ability to quickly chase you down pyramid up walls or create a pyramid to attack a low-flying helicopter. This also was likely done because making a movie with slow-moving zombies to be thrilling takes a lot of skill, and audiences today might prefer the action-packed CGI sequences of the Olympic-level zombies. The game zombies resemble those of the movie, but don't seem to run quite as fast. The difference is that the game, like every other zombie game, doesn't think that zombies outnumbering humans by a large ratio is exciting enough. So they include different zombie archetypes to act as boss enemies for the sake of fun and playability. Like most zombie games, they most likely copy and pasted the zombie types from Left 4 Dead with, a tank zombie and gas zombies and alike. However, surviving these new forms of zombies might prove to be just as difficult as the movie zombies, if not a little bit more. So if you're wondering how survivability in World War Z would be, the answer would depend really on the version. The book, for example, has its flaws. Max seemed a little too caught up with the reputation of zombies being able to take nearly anything without dying, of course with the exception of headshots or severe head trauma. As a result, I'm going to point out the issues with the book and give you a more realistic take on World War Z and explain how survival might work in there, because even so, Max did a fairly good job of explaining that survivability is possible for various types of people in his book, so I wanted to go with a slightly more realistic version. The first inaccuracy, and maybe the most important, would be the Battle of Yonkers. It showcased a fundamental lack of understanding of the hardware the military uses. The US military is fairly open about the hardware we have, and generally speaking, likes to show it off, while keeping the sensitive things obviously secret. The first issue was, and as I was saying, is the strict adherence to the idea that in order to stop a zombie, you have to hit it in the head. That's just not the case. A headshot is required to kill a zombie, but stopping a zombie is all about making it combat ineffective as an offensive force. A zombie that cannot walk has had its combat effectiveness reduced because now it has to crawl, and given that the arms might not be the most effective means to move oneself across any distance, the zombie has been slowed, further reducing its effectiveness and giving the troops more time to pick it off. More to that point, even if someone is infected and turned into a zombie, that doesn't increase their muscle mass. A zombie might not feel pain or fatigue, but that same zombie still has the muscle mass that it had when it died, and that muscle mass still has to pull it across the ground. To add to that point, bullets, especially the larger rounds like 7.62 and 50 BMG, can easily break and shatter bones. Even an inaccurate burst of machine gun fire in the center mass of a zombie horde can sever the spine, shatter bones in the arms, or even the legs if they aim low. And all this reduces the effectiveness of a zombie that gets hit, and that doesn't even include the damage caused to the muscles by the shockwave and cavity created when a bullet impacts something soft like the soft tissue of a human. Damaged muscle or compromised muscle or even severed muscle from a bullet is going to be completely useless to the zombie. The reality is that bullets do far more damage than what is depicted in the book, and I'm not even done talking about them. Just give me a minute and I'll be right back at it. There also seemed to be a fundamental disconnect on the side of artillery. Carpeting an area with a near constant barrage of artillery fire from both the 155mm howitzers and the MLRS would make such a choke point impassable. If a colony of ants was trying to cross a 2x4 that was being sprayed with a mist from a hose, and should an ant get hit a couple times with a drop of water it would die, then no matter how many ants from that colony charged on that 2x4, they'd still all meet their end, because that is what a choke point is. It's how it works. They get funneled into a spot that they can be quickly and easily dispatched, because in order for them to be victorious, they have to pass through an impassable kill zone. Even if zombies are only able to be killed by traumatic injury to the head, with that much artillery falling, the effects of it would be devastating. At very least, the impact tremors would be knocking them down along with the shock waves, and zombies would also be getting immobilized from physical damage caused by the blast, and they'd be crawling around on the ground. All this would create a pile up and zombies crawling around, which leaves them in the fire for a longer duration, allowing more artillery shells to come in and finish them off, because there is just kind of no way for them to get through such a torrential downpour of high explosive and cluster munitions. Then you have the tanks. And even if Command was dumb enough to outfit the tanks with the M829 armor-piercing rounds, we're still talking about a round that was designed to penetrate enemy tank armor with nothing but kinetic energy. If a shell designed to take out a tank by punching a hole through the armor by sheer force is fired into a horde of zombies, then we're talking about a shell that would penetrate through countless zombies, causing damage and destruction as it goes until it finally runs out of juice and sticks in some unfortunate zombie. The truth is, tanks would likely be outfitted with heat, which means high explosive anti-tank, and canister shells. And then every spare spot on the outside of that tank would be loaded down with cases of extra 7.62 and 50 cal ammo. The M1A2 has a coax M240, a loader's M240 on some variants, and an M250 cal for the commander. Newer variants of the M1A2 have that 50 cal in a crow system, which allows it to be accurately fired from inside the tank. Along with that, you have the 240 that the gunner could fire simultaneously. Abrams tanks would be devastating against the undead because, as stated before, bullets do a lot of damage, and even if they do not kill the zombie, the bullet can certainly immobilize it. It's also worth bringing up that tanks firing their machine guns at head level, sweeping left to right or right to left, while squirting out bursts of 7.62 or 50 BMG rounds would be fairly devastating, because these rounds are not exactly weak or slow. They would punch through several layers of zombies before running out of juice. Moving out of the armor, because the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle has M240s and has a chain gun, which is just massive and devastating. So let's move into infantry, and coincidentally, infantry also has M240s and M250 cals, and they are infantry portable weapons. Combine that with the M4 rifles and M249s, that doesn't even account for air power like Apache helicopters, which would have been the chopper used. Not the Comanche, but the Apache. And then you have fighter jets that would likely be striking deeper in the horde with cluster munitions and probably even napalm, which would burn the zombies to a point of destruction, or burn them to a point that their muscles would be completely cooked and the nerves fried. In other words, they would be completely useless, if not dead. Another thing the napalm could do is completely cook their head or burn their head, and if it didn't kill them, it could burn their eyes to an extent that they wouldn't even be able to spot prey. Either way, with the napalm, it would make them ineffective and able to be dispatched and disposed of later. But let's say the military, whether defeated or victorious at Yonkers, was pushed back to the western safe zone, and everything that happened leadership-wise had occurred. You know, things like the creation of distress. Well, then let's start with distress and their decisions. The replacement of the M4 rifle with the SIR was useless and a waste of resources. It would have been easier to replace the trigger groups with the semi-automatic SEER, and then retrain your forces to aim for the head. As far as replacement parts go, in large part, the M4 is made out of aluminum and steel, both of which are not terribly difficult to find and scrap. And then you have the fact that the AR-15 is the most popular rifle in the United States, and more often than not, they are built to what is known as mil spec, which means that in many cases replacing things like handguard stocks, buffers, recoil springs, castle nuts, gas tubes, and any other part not only may not need to be manufactured, but might easily be found in homes or among dead civilians that couldn't outrun Zach. Next, we have the resource issues. Truth be told, there was absolutely no reason for the Air Force to be gutted, nor was there a reason for the Abrams to be warehoused. The U.S. is kind of unique in the fact that we are rich with natural resources. Metal recycling plants, melting down anything deemed useless, combined with a handful of iron ore mines and metal foundries, could be guarded by the military and put back in action, even if they were in infested zones. Then you have oil platforms in the Gulf and the rich oil fields of Alaska, which would likely make it through pretty much untouched because of Alaska's weather and overall terrain. The hardest part would be keeping the oil fields running, but with steel plants cranking out wartime items, which would include things like drill pipe, oil could be pumped and either shipped by a tanker commandeered by the military down to a refinery, or refined on site and then shipped down as the various forms of fuel required. You might be wondering, well, how would the iron ore or the oil from the Gulf or fuel from the Gulf make it from the secured mines or refineries to the safe zone? And the answer is trains. A freight train can move millions of pounds of cargo on relatively little fuel, and with their weight and decently high speed of about 65 miles an hour, a freight train could drive clean through cars or trucks, including semi-trucks, that might be on the tracks. And they could even drive through zombie hordes on the extremely large end of the spectrum. And while it's not ideal for trains to run over organic materials like animals or people, because that flesh can clog up the traction motors, which turn the wheels and make the train move, freight trains often have multiple locomotives to help with the weight, or simply, sometimes they're just in neutral and along for the ride to be moved from one rail yard to another. So, assuming that a train plowed through a massive horde and had a failure of the traction motors on the lead locomotive, then it could just go into neutral and be pushed through by the other locomotives until it reaches the safe zone, or finds a safe spot to stop and clear the blockage and repair the traction motors. Because you have to remember that with the size of trains and the relative small size of people, if it is easy to see how a train would win. I mean, it's kind of stupid to say because trains are really heavy, but they're also really big, and you can see it so clearly when you actually see someone standing next to a train. They are truly maths, but to sum it up, the fuel economy of trains, their power, their ability to pretty much not be stopped by anything, makes trains the ideal vehicle for freight operations through infested or infected territory. Now, trains do have issues. Mechanically, they do fail. And then they can derail from track issues, mechanical issues, or even outside environmental forces. But when someone isn't overly worried about the environmental impact of spilled cargo, like, say, oil or fuel, It wouldn't be terribly tough for forces to secure the area while the track is cleared and repaired if necessary, and the damaged cargo is left behind, even if it is fuel. What does all that mean? Well, surviving World War Z, the book, might be easier than one might expect. When you look at it realistically and tactically, things probably would have ended up slightly different. Working with the government would mean security and food. The military would have more effective weaponry and probably wouldn't have wasted all that time retooling, which would have made the war probably significantly shorter. Now, that doesn't mean that it would be safe for everybody. Some jobs like working on a mine or a oil field that is in infested territory or something like that would be dangerous, but more than likely those crews would either be compensated for their extra hazard or they might get a month or a week off and be shuttled in shifts by freight train. The point is that some work might be dangerous, but so far being in a safe zone or in the military for World War Z, the realistic take is actually fairly survivable. Because as I said, I have to look at this from a different, slightly more realistic take, because Max covered fairly well in the book how survivable it was in his perception, his take on things, even if I feel like it's slightly unrealistic. So again, I do feel like I have to say that this is a slightly more realistic take that I have thought about for a while. But anyway, let's get back at it. Realistically, it would be easier to do a lot of things, even protect safe zones and clear hordes, or even groups of stragglers that the military cannot handle due to being stretched thin or lacking the spare equipment. Humanity has unknowingly been producing tools that could seek out hordes of zombies, or rather groups of them, or even attract them in and destroy them. So if you want the option of seeking out a horde to destroy them, and you can't use military equipment, and they're stretched a little thin right now, well, this could be handled by swinging through an out-of-service mine and deforestation yard. Heavy equipment is ideal for combating zombies, and as the name implies, it is heavy. And then you have power. So the zombies are, even if they were incredibly strong, they're not going to lift most of this equipment. If a horde is inbound to a safe zone, a procured Caterpillar D11 or otherwise large elevated final drive bulldozer would work great. Just drive down the road into the horde with the blade up high to knock them down under the machine and hopefully under the tracks. And then those that are not killed by the tracks of the dozer could be finished off by pulling a cultivation plow behind the bulldozer, or by being followed by a self-propelled deforestation mulcher. Some of these can be as small as on a bobcat, and some of them are as large as a bulldozer and able to lift the mulcher head and angle it as needed while chewing through an entire tree. So either way, it'd make short work of the zombies on the ground. Then, once the horde is taken out, they can drive back to the safe zone and have the machines sprayed down with disinfectant and wait for the next horde. If a horde is too large or otherwise in an area unsuitable for a bulldozer and or mulcher combo destruction, then a Hogzilla tub grinder, which is basically a semi-truck trailer with a 1,000 horsepower engine that runs a grinder often used to dispose of junk wood and tree stumps, would do the trick. Add some ramps up to the rotating tub and Zach will jump into the tub after the sound with some enthusiasm. The little zombie bits then run up a conveyor belt and are left in a neat pile for later burning. These grinders, or mulchers, also come in a horizontal model, but with a few modifications. Even the horizontal model could have Zach running headfirst into the machine that is able to literally eat whole trees, and do so at a rate that is usually a problem for semi-trucks to keep up with, because they load them faster than they can get the trucks there. It should also be said that the same tactic can be used at the walls of a safe zone. If the safe zone does have walls, a long-reach excavator fitted with a hydraulic thumb could pick up and crush groups of zombies approaching, or drop them into a grinder. Overall, it's messy, but effective, and safe while taking a small amount of manpower to accomplish. allowing the military to focus on larger threats. The only downside isn't much of a downside with oil platforms still working and refineries still cranking out fuel, but to say it, the downside actually is that a lot of these machines do chug diesel like an alcoholic drinks beer. Now, to be on your own in an infected territory or make it on your own from an infected territory to a safe zone is another animal altogether. Surviving out there would be tough. Moving at night means being unable to see if there's a horde ahead of you, but moving during the day would mean being able to be seen by Zach or other survivors who may or may not have good intentions. Preppers with bunkers would be in a fairly good way provided they have enough food, water, and a solid air and waste management system. People without mechanical knowledge or knowledge of firearms would be at a disadvantage, even if firearms are carried with them purely to defend against others who want to do them harm. While cars might be useless due to clogged roads, they might still have limited abilities on back roads. Both of these could be circumvented with a motorcycle, dirt bike, ATV, or even a bicycle. However, all these make you vulnerable to attack from other survivors interested in your gear or worse. People with mechanical tendencies or firearm skills who can survive in the wild and hunt will be better off than those who don't. If someone can get deep into the woods where they can build a cabin, they will be less likely to see Zach than anywhere else. Provided the area stays flush with game, it is possible to hold out in the wild for the long term. Knowing how to filter or otherwise purify water would also be a required skill, considering that Zach can be found in large concentrations in bodies of water. Without purification knowledge, drinking the water that could be rich with particles of decomposing zombies would make a survivor potentially sick or even infect them if they have a cut in their mouth. At the same time, survivors would also need to be smart. Swimming in any shallow body of water would probably be highly risky and not advised. Survivors on boats or ships would also be held up in an ideal place provided that no one is infected on the boat. This type of survival would require less technical knowledge, but also means that food, and in some cases of vessels on the ocean, water, could be a tricky thing to obtain. Given practical skills, survival knowledge, combat skills, and common sense, surviving the realistic take of World War Z would prove to be manageable for some, but certainly not easy. Realistically, most people do not know these skills. The odds of many surviving would be slim. Survival would also depend on where someone is geographically located. Being in a city would likely be tough to survive, especially if someone holds up and waits for it to blow over. Getting out of the city would almost certainly be a death sentence, with maybe the exception of breaking it up into short moves at a time from one piece of cover to another. But if you get spotted just once, it's all over. Suburbs and rural areas would be easier to survive, even as hordes begin to form. The slow speed of the zombies in the open terrain means that they have less opportunities to box you in. Ultimately, surviving the realistic take of the book would be possible for some and considerably easier for the military to combat the zombie. What about the movie or the game? Well, I'm going to go off the assumption that the movie and the game follow the basic overall story of the book, which means that eventually they will, fall back to the Western safe zone, distress will be created, so on and so forth. This means that the only new factor to consider is a change in the zombies' abilities, in some cases their behavior. Across the board, surviving the zombie apocalypse in the game or movie version would be far more difficult than the book. That includes the initial outbreak phase and pretty much everything else, because the zombies are faster. They have different priorities, meaning that they don't worry about consuming their prey, just infecting them. The period of time from infection to reanimation is considerably less, and they have the agility of an Olympic athlete. It doesn't matter if you're in a city or a town, the suburbs, it's going to be difficult to survive primarily because they are more aggressive and they have more speed and more agility. Then you have special zombie types that you would find in the game, because sprinting zombies, they're not hard enough. So you got to throw in tanks and zombies that would release a toxic cloud when you kill them, and that will make it far more difficult than even before. And that's not just for civilians in cities and towns Infantry forces not behind solid armor would be exposed to the fast-moving zombies. So what happens if you're on the ground? Well, if spotted by one or more of these fast and powerful zombies, or special zombies, being the tanks or the ones that release a cloud, the best thing a survivor could do is open the distance between them and the zombie as rapidly as possible. This would best be done with a car or a motorcycle and be more effective over rough terrain that would slow down the zombie, like going up a hill or over loose soil like sand. If on foot, the best thing a survivor could do is find a solid place to take shelter and wait what could be several days to a week for the zombies to lose interest. Without shelter, the only option is to run or fight. Combating the zombie should be a last resort, especially if a special is present. A survivor fighting a lone zombie might be fine, but with how fast they are and the fact that they are known to leap and tackle from a distance, the survivor had better put it down in a smart manner and do it quickly. If they use a gun, they better have a plan to get out of there or be hidden by the time other zombies sprint to the scene of the sound. It goes without saying that specials are across the board more dangerous. Zombies that can take a lot of damage while charging you to then slam you against the ground repeatedly. Obviously that's going to be a bit more of a problem than, say, a zombie that can just sprint. Now, also it's kind of worth at least saying that in real life a zombie that big smashing you against the ground probably going to cause internal organ damage. So it's probably going to end up being a fatal encounter, even if any other survivors that might be with you end up killing that zombie. However, due to their superior numbers, the biggest concern should always be the sheer speed of your average zombie from the game or film scenario. So to survive this, again, a serious prepper with a bunker that can last the duration of the outbreak or the war would likely be fine. Zach would never have any reason to think that anyone would be beneath the ground, but for most people, survival would be best assured by knowing a lot of the same skills that you would need to survive the book version. But also emphasizing getting to a point of good fortification, natural or otherwise, or getting to an extremely remote place that may not be as remote as you think, with other survivors having the same idea. Natural fortification could be mountainous areas that are extremely steep or rocky, or living somewhere, again, like on a mountain, but above the snow line where it's cold year-round. The cold weather will protect you from the zombies, but as with anything else, it won't protect you from other survivors who might want what you have and figure they'll just take it, considering that there's no one around to punish them for their bad behavior. Ultimately, surviving the book in its original state with the things that I think are inaccurate unchanged would be tough no matter who or where you are, with maybe the exception of the Western Safe Zone or Hawaii. Surviving the book with the inaccuracies that were pointed out corrected to better reflect reality might actually be slightly easier. The military would keep a lot of its bite, and the lack of fuel shortages along with other materials, raw and otherwise, would open up more opportunities for zombie disposal. Surviving the film or the game versions would be difficult no matter where you are. Any encounter due to sheer speed would be an extremely dangerous proposition. Now there are some people that'll be well off no matter what version it is. Preppers with bunkers and people with knowledge. Also tankers would be fairly well off. Although the disclaimer on that would be that even people with survival and weapon knowledge have their odds go down in the film or book version due to the increase in danger. I do want to be very clear on that. And while a tank crew would be safe from any of the zombies from literally any of the versions, in the original book version, they were transferred out of their so-called ineffective fighting machines and likely into infantry units, meaning that tank crews may not be in a better position, at least in the original book. So World War Z is survivable across the board from a big picture, country, or humanity standpoint. As far as the little picture goes, the one person trying to survive is possible, but without proper knowledge or being in the right place to ride it out, you probably won't survive World War Z. I do want to say that this is in no way meant to insult Max Brooks' work. I love the book, and even though I think he got a few things wrong and got hung up on a few things here and there and kind of made some bad decisions for the characters in the book, at the end of the day, it was how he envisioned the zombie apocalypse, and it's still maybe one of the best portrayals ever put to paper. Anyway. Sorry for determining that many of you probably won't survive World War Z, but thanks for watching and have a great day.